Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 223 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. Today, I return to my exploration of the Dungeon Master's Guide. We'll be discussing Chapter 4, Creating Non-Player Characters. This chapter has lots of useful advice and tables for fleshing out your NPCs. So I'm really excited to return to our Dungeon Master's Guide series. We're starting to pick up steam with that. I feel like I'm really hoping that one day we will complete the Dungeon Master's Guide. I would love to give similar treatment to Xanathar's Guide, maybe some of the stuff in Volo's Guide. The Sage Advice Compendium would be great to discuss. So yeah, this endless material. Probably before we finish the DMG, the new book, the Tome of Foes, I think it's called, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes will be out, which might be something else we want to discuss. Who knows? So yeah, no shortage of things to talk about. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that my latest D&D supplement, Relics of Power, is for sale on my website. And I, for a limited time, have a bundle where you can get Relics of Power as well as my adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth, together and save a couple bucks. So Relics of Power is a D&D supplement that shows you how you can create magic items that scale in power with your player characters. And I show you how you can create your own items from scratch. Also, how you can take existing items from the Dungeon Master's Guide and convert them into relics. And finally, I give you a dozen examples. Among those examples are relics from my current campaign, Hinterlands of Elandria. And we are still playing that campaign, and I'm developing those relics as we go. So right now, they only go up to like level 5 in Relics of Power. But what I'm going to do is, as we progress through the campaign and as I power up those relics for the player characters, I will update Relics of Power with the new versions that will go up to higher and higher levels. And eventually we'll get to level 20. And so those of you who purchase Relics of Power, whether as part of the bundle or just by itself, when I do an update, you will get an email and you'll be able to download the updated version. So you'll get those when I add those. So that'll be kind of fun, I think. So the nice thing about that is you'll kind of get to see the process of how these develop during the campaign, because one of the, I think, awesome things about relics is how you can customize them to individual characters and to your campaign and to the story, and really tie them into the world and what's going on. And you can kind of see this, especially if you watch or listen to the campaign, because, you know, right now, like I said, the player characters are level 5. I have no idea what these relics will do at level 20. Well, I have some ideas, but probably I have no idea, because there's a lot of time between level 5 and level 20 for the characters to grow and develop and change. And, you know, by developing these relics as needed, as the players advance, I can keep them relevant, as opposed to if I develop them up to level 20 now, well, you know, my idea of where the characters will be at 20th level right now is probably very different from where they'll actually be and what kind of characters they'll be. Because who knows, maybe one of the players multi-classes and takes their character in a totally different direction that I didn't anticipate. So that's a nice thing about this, is you can kind of do it as you go and constantly be tweaking these to better fit the player characters. So yeah, I'm really excited with the supplement. I'm really happy with how it's been received so far. So I hope you'll check it out. So speaking of my supplements that I've been publishing, I've published 2 now, And I have quite a few ideas for future supplements. Quite a few of these I've already done some writing on. Some of them I've done a lot of writing on. And I thought it would be fun to get your feedback on which of these you're most interested in. So I put up a survey for people to vote on which of these they'd like to see next. And you, I hope, will go take the survey too. The more responses I get, the better. But right now, here are the options. So these are all things that I've done at least some work on, if not a lot of work on. So they'll probably all happen eventually in some way, shape, or form, but you can help me decide which to focus on next. So one would be new magic items for D&D. So just new magic items, simple as that. New backgrounds. So I have actually a few backgrounds that I've come up with for this campaign I'm running and previous things I've done. And I could always come up with more and just provide new backgrounds. New races and subclasses. Again, I already have some I've come up with for Primordia, but I could provide some new races or not subclasses, I'm sorry, races and sub-races that you can play. New monsters. Same kind of thing. I've got some I've developed already. I could develop more and give you some new monsters to play with. New cleric domains. Same deal. Cursed items. Now this is something that came directly from the Discord community, I believe. I'd never thought of doing something on cursed items. But we were having a discussion about cursed items and kind of how to handle them as a DM, because cursed items is definitely something that you can totally screw up as a DM. You can ruin your game with them. You can ruin a player or all the players' fun with them, or they could like take your game to the next level. They could be awesome. And as with so many things, it's all in your execution. And so we were having a discussion in the Discord community about, how we handle cursed items and specifically how you can use them in a way that that the players won't hate them and won't hate you for introducing them. I haven't used cursed items a lot, but for the most part, I think every time I have used them, they've ended up being a lot of fun and the players enjoyed it. So I was talking a little bit about my philosophy and the fact that personally, I think the quote Gygaxian way of using a cursed item, or at least how I imagine he would use a cursed item, as kind of a gotcha for the players, like, haha, you attuned to this item, now you're screwed, is not the way you want to use cursed item. That is not the way to use a cursed item and have it enhance your game. That is the way that's most likely to result in players hating the items and maybe even hating you, or at least hating what this item has done to the game. So yeah, I thought, well, maybe this would be a cool thing to write a supplement on how I approach cursed items, advice on designing them and implementing them in the game and all that stuff, as well as, of course, I would think as some cursed items as examples or samples. So I added that to the list just from that conversation because it seemed to be something people were interested in. And surprisingly, so far, it's been one of the more popular of the options. So right now, I'd say that there's a pretty good chance that that will be one of the next things I do. Maybe not the very next thing I do, just because, like I said, a lot of these I've already done a lot of work on, and the cursed items is something new. So I've taken some notes on it. I've written some ideas, but I mean, it's the least developed of all these things. So it probably wouldn't be the very next thing I did, but maybe the thing after that. But let me know what you think. Go and vote. Next, flexible encounters. So I've talked about this quite a bit on the show, but I could write something up on, flexible encounters and how I use them, kind of my alternative to random encounters. And then finally, the last idea I had was spellcasting dragons. So if you look at dragons in the 5th edition Monster Manual, there's an alternate rule where they can have spellcasting abilities, and it gives a pretty simple system to figure out how many spells a dragon would have and what level those spells would be, et cetera, et cetera. But what it doesn't tell you is what those spells would actually be. And I decided in the very beginning when I started working on Primordia that all of the dragons in Primordia would be spellcasting dragons. And it's funny. I hype 5th edition a lot on this show, and for the most part, I'm a big fan of 5th edition, and I think most of the changes that have been made are improvements over how things were done in previous editions. But one thing that I'm kind of iffy about is a lot of the monsters, especially the more powerful monsters like dragons and demons, et cetera, have really lost a lot from previous editions as far as various things they could do and things like that. And the reason I say I'm kind of torn about it is because on the one hand, it does make them easier to run and simpler to deal with as a GM. And I'm a fan of that. But a lot of times it's resulted in a lot of the 5th edition monsters are kind of boring. They don't have much going on as far as special abilities or interesting things they can do in combat. They get kind of samey. A lot of the monsters are just like, it has a few attacks, it has hit points, it has an arm class, and that's kind of it. And especially things like demons and dragons that in previous editions had so many cool things they could do and have been so watered down. It makes me kind of sad, but I don't know. I think overall I'm okay with it because, if I'm just going to on the fly run a dragon or a demon, I can use what's in the monster manual and it's going to be pretty simple to deal with. But if I'm going to use something like a dragon as like a nemesis, I can go back to my 3rd edition and my 2nd edition and look at, what the red dragon could do back then and maybe bring some of that stuff back into 5th edition because it's super easy to convert previous editions to 5th edition. So I guess I'm okay with it because I think for most GMs that the simplified version is probably best. But for those of us that want to get more nitty gritty, we can always refer to previous editions and get that material. So this is one I've done quite a bit of work on. And patrons have seen some of this stuff where I started going through all of the different types of dragons and deciding, here's an average list of spells that a young red dragon would have. Here's the list of spells that an adult blue dragon would have, et cetera, as well as explanation on why I chose those spells, a little bit more on the personalities of the dragons and stuff like that. So that's something I could do. So basically what this would be, it would take each type of dragon, like the red dragon, and it would take each version from the monster manual. So I think there's like, red dragon wormling, the young, the adult, and then the ancient, I think are the age categories they've been watered down to in 5th edition. So I would take each of those and I would say, okay, an adult red dragon, here are the spells it might have. Here's why it has those spells and that kind of thing. I think a lot of times the wormlings don't have spells, if I remember right, but the ones that would have spells, I go through that. And again, like any other monster in the book, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the episode, that's like the generic average monster, right? So it's not to say that every adult red dragon in Primordia has these spells. They don't. They'd all be different. But this is something to start you out with. And, if you need to do one on the fly, you can use these spells. But if you're preparing one, you might want to come up with your own spells and maybe just use mine as inspiration. But I thought that might be a fun thing. Depending how much additional information I gave on the dragons, I might split that one up into 2 separate supplements, one for the chromatic and one for the metallic. But that would really depend on how big the thing gets. So those are the options. There are 8 different options. So again, new magic items, new backgrounds, new races and sub-races, new monsters, new cleric domains, a write-up on how to use cursed items, a write-up on how to use flexible encounters, or a write-up on spellcasting dragons, which again might end up being two different ones, one for chromatic and one for metallic. So head to the show notes, starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey for this episode, and follow the link to the survey. And please let me know which of those you would most like to see first. And the way I set up the survey is you can rate each of them. So you actually don't have to just pick one. You can say, this is the first one I'd like to see, this is the second, and so on. And it really will help me see which of these people are most interested in, and I can focus my efforts there. Speaking of surveys, I have another survey I'd love your feedback on. I have been considering writing a book on being a game master. What a shocker, right? So I've had numerous listeners suggest that I do some kind of Kickstarter. I've had many listeners request various types of advice on GMing, especially for new GMs. And so it occurred to me, I could probably put together a pretty substantial tome on GMing tips and tricks and things like that, just by going by all the topics I've covered on this show and all the topics I hope to cover in the future. If I just took that, probably easily have a 200 or 300 page book, I would guess. But what would make it even more awesome, I almost said awesomer. I don't think that's the word. What would make it even more awesome, though, is if I got even more ideas from you guys as far as questions you would like this book to answer, or topics you'd like this book to cover. So what I'm asking is, first of all, would you be interested in a book by yours truly on GMing? And second, if you are interested, what are questions you would like that book to answer, or what are topics you would like that book to cover? And I hope to get a lot of feedback on this and use that feedback to come up with my chapter outline and my topic outline as far as everything that's going to be in this book. And if there's enough interest, then maybe this is something I will do a Kickstarter for, and I can use that outline for the Kickstarter to tell people this is all the things the book will cover. And maybe during the Kickstarter, I'll get more suggestions, which would be great too. But the more I can get right now at this stage in the game, the better. And I can start planning this. Another question I asked is, would you prefer that this book be completely system or game neutral? Or would you prefer that it focus in a bit on D&D as far as for examples? And I kind of go back and forth myself on which of those would be best. I do feel that obviously if I could do it system neutral, like that would be the best for the most people, because not everybody plays D&D. But I probably won't know till I actually start writing the thing, but that may not be the greatest way to do it. It may be too difficult to really explain things well in a way that doesn't use any kind of game or system as an example or to illustrate what I'm talking about. So if I were going to use the game as an example or illustration, I mean, we don't really have to debate on what that game would be. It would be D&D. It's hands down the most popular RPG out there. It's the gateway RPG. It's a game everybody knows, most people have played, and most likely if someone is going to play or run an RPG for the first time, statistically speaking, they're probably going to be using D&D. So right now I'm leaning towards having at least somewhat of a D&D focus, because I anticipate that I will need something as an example and illustration. But like I said, I won't know for sure until I actually start writing the thing. But let me know what you think, if you'd prefer it to be neutral or have a bit of a D&D focus. So I'll have a link to that as well. There's a post on our forum about it, and there's also a post on the Game Masters Journey Google Plus community about it. So either of those places are good places to respond, whichever you prefer. Or if you prefer, you can email me your ideas and suggestions. So what I'm really looking for above and beyond, would you just be interested in this, is the topics you'd like to see a book like this cover. And right now, my thought is that it will start at the very beginning. So chapter 1 of the book assumes you're brand new to GMing and you don't know anything, and start with the basics. But it's not going to be a book just for new GMs. It's going to be a book for all GMs. So as we go through the book, we're going to get to more and more advanced topics and applications. So please head to the show notes, starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey. Please let me know what you'd like as far as a GM guidebook, or you can email me and also take my survey for the next supplement. So the next supplement is something that could be out within, a couple months or something like that. This GM guidebook thing, this is more of a long-term thing that I would, if I decide to do it, that I would kickstart and then do. So this is more of a long-term project where the supplement is more on the horizon. And finally, before we get to that DMG, I just have a few new patrons I want to thank. So thank you to Kendall, Gabe, and Angel. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. And while I'm thanking listener GMs for their support, I also want to send a thank you to everyone who's gotten my supplements lately. Really appreciate it. I've had a lot of people check out Relics of Power, and quite a few people have taken advantage of the bundle, which is awesome, and have gotten some good feedback back already. And so, I'm really excited with the response, and I'd love to hear from more of you what you thought of it. And I'd really love to see the relics you guys come up with. So already some people have posted some to our forums. So feel free to head on over to our forum and share any relics you come up with the community. I'd love to see them. Today, we return to our discussion and exploration of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And today we are ready for Chapter 4, Creating Non-Player Characters. So if you're new to the show, this is the latest in a pretty extensive series of episodes in which I have been going through first the Player's Handbook and now the Dungeon Master's Guide, going through pretty much page by page and doing an exploration of these core books of D&D, and just teasing out all the interesting bits and discussing them. So if you're new to the game or new to GMing, this is going to be a great introduction to the system for you. If you're more experienced with the game and or with GMing, then it'll be a great review of the system for you. So in the Player's Handbook, I didn't cover everything in the Player's Handbook. I focused on the DM relevant stuff. So we didn't so much go into the different classes and the different spells and stuff like that. We more focused on the general systems of the game. And then we have gone to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Dungeon Master's Guide, on the other hand, I've been covering pretty much page by page, with the exception of, I believe it was it chapter 2, the chapter on the planes? Yeah, chapter 2, the multiverse. We covered the introduction to that, and we covered the astral plane, but then we skipped ahead to chapter 3, and I do intend to return to chapter 2 at some point and discuss the other planes, but I decided to make that its own separate series of episodes, because what I'm really most excited about talking about in the DMG are the various optional rules and rules variants and all the different ways that you can customize your game to be exactly what you want. And I'm really looking forward to discussing some of the different options that you have, and also hitting upon just any good general GM knowledge that we find in this book, because this is a show about GMing. So there's a lot of great stuff for GMs in this book. So if you want to get caught up on all of this, you can head to the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey. And I will have links to all the previous episodes in the series, and you can go back and listen to them in order. So today we're talking about chapter 4, creating non-player characters. I would love to get through this chapter today, but I never know how long these are going to be until I do them. So we'll just see how far we get. So a non-player character simply is any character controlled by the Dungeon Master or the Game Master. Any player who isn't controlled, or any character who isn't controlled by a player, hence the term non-player character, or NPC for short. NPCs can be enemies or allies, regular folk, or named monsters. They can include the local innkeeper, the old wizard who lives in a tower on the outskirts of town, the Death Knight out to destroy the kingdom, and the dragon counting gold in its cavernous lair. This chapter shows you how to flesh out non-player characters for your game. For guidelines on generating monster-like stat blocks for an NPC, see Chapter 9, The Dungeon Master's Workshop, which one day we will discuss Chapter 9, but it'll probably take us a little while to get all the way to Chapter 9. So I want to point out really quickly that a non-player character is any character controlled by the GM, and in D&D and in other games, that includes monsters. So I know that some people get this dichotomy in their mind where an NPC is a humanoid and a monster is something different. And although it's understandable why you might look at it that way, I think it's much better to remember that monsters are NPCs too. And a good monster has as much personality as a humanoid NPC would be. So I think it's really helpful to remember that monsters are NPCs too, or at least they should be. At least the intelligent ones, right? But even animals have their own personalities when you get to know them better. So designing NPCs. Nothing brings your adventures and campaigns to life better than a cast of well-developed NPCs. That said, NPCs in your game rarely need as much complexity as a well-crafted character in a novel or movie. Most NPCs are bit players in the campaign, whereas the adventurers are the stars. So sometimes you're going to know the difference between what we'll call an important NPC and one not so much. So an important NPC might be someone like the nemesis of the player characters, or the patron of the player characters, or a member of a player character's family, or some other person in their backstory that's important to the character. So sometimes as a GM, you know before the game starts that certain NPCs are going to be important either to the story or to the characters. So those are NPCs that you want to spend some more time with and flesh out. But then there are also going to be times when you don't know. And what oftentimes happens here is you have an NPC that isn't someone that you as a GM see as important. Maybe the merchant at a store, or the innkeeper at an inn, or something like that. And you might just come up with a few details about that character because you think they're just going to be, on camera for a moment and that's the end. But for some reason, the players latch onto that character, and suddenly that character becomes important because the player characters decide the character is important for whatever reason. So, as with all things GMing, it's this combination of preparing and using stuff that you've prepared ahead of time, but also improvising and coming up with stuff that you need on the fly during the game as you need it. So this will often happen with NPCs when you have an NPC that you haven't developed a lot because you don't think they'll be important, but during play they become important and you have to kind of flesh them out on the fly. So the nice thing is that this chapter of the DMG has some useful tables and things that will help you with that. These tables are also useful, when you're preparing for a game to give you ideas and help you flesh out NPCs. But I think when they're most useful is those times during play when you have to flesh out an NPC on the fly, and maybe you need some inspiration or some ideas, or maybe it's truly just some random person on the street and you just want to come up with some random things about that character. This chapter will help you out with all of that. So here we're going to differentiate between quick NPCs and detailed NPCs, which is kind of what I was just talking about. So a detailed NPC is going to be a more important NPC. So for quick NPCs, an NPC doesn't need combat statistics unless it poses a threat. Or another way to say it is an NPC doesn't need combat statistics unless you anticipate the player characters are going to fight the NPC, or the NPC is going to fight alongside the player characters. And even then, they may not need combat statistics, depending on how you're going to run that encounter, because there's no rule out there that says, as a DM, you have to make dice rolls for all of the NPCs in an encounter. You can hand wave a lot of the stuff that happens among NPCs if you want to speed up play and keep the pace going. Moreover, most NPCs need only one or two qualities to make them memorable. For example, your players will have no trouble remembering the no-nonsense blacksmith with the tattoo of the black rose on his right shoulder, or the badly dressed bard with the broken nose. And that's a really great tip. And this applies to so many things, not just NPCs. But to make a memorable NPC, just think of one or two or three interesting and distinguishing things about that character, and focus on those two or three things, and you're good to go, because it's enough that the player characters will remember it, and it gives them enough that they can create a mental image of this character. But it's not so much that you overwhelm them and they end up not remembering any of it. And this is great advice for really anything you describe in your game, whether that's describing the inn that the characters have walked into, the city that they're in, or if you're describing something about your world, or you're describing a monster they encounter, or a room that they walk into. Anything that you describe, you're better off focusing on just two or three at most interesting things about that to describe, instead of, coming up with this long description with all these details, because your player characters aren't going to remember any of that. But if you give them just two or three interesting things, they're likely to remember that. So we were just discussing on the Discord server, we were talking about world building, and someone was asking, how much or how do you get players to be interested in your world building, or interested in details of the world? And some people were saying that basically the players won't be interested, or I don't think people on the server were saying that, but I've seen that out there. People say, oh, the players aren't going to care about your world building. And that's definitely true if you do it the way a lot of people do it, which is just overloading the players with a bunch of information they don't want and don't care about. If that's how you approach it, then yeah, they probably won't care about your world building. But if you approach it more like what we're talking about here, where you're just giving a few interesting details, that's more manageable and isn't going to take up a lot of time, then they may care. And the other side of that is making those details relevant. So a great illustration of this is a good fantasy novel, or a good sci-fi novel, or any book where there's world building involved, where the author has to get across to you what this world is like. You'll notice in stories that do this well, that you're given details about the world, or you're given details about a character as they become relevant to the story, or as the point of view character is noticing them. Stories that don't do this so well will just give you paragraphs and paragraphs of information about the setting or about a character or whatever that you as a reader don't care about, because it's not related to anything that's going on. So if you read stories, then you've probably noticed this, and this is something you can directly apply to your GMing, because it's the same kind of thing. Just as a reader, a long description of something that doesn't really seem to matter is boring, and you end up skimming it or skipping it. And in the same way, as a GM, a long description of your city or a character or a tavern or whatever you're describing, if it's too long and the details you're giving aren't directly relevant to something that's going on, the players kind of check out and they're not paying attention and they're bored and et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely a fine line between too much and too little description. And it's an art kind of finding that balance. And it's going to vary from group to group because obviously different players are going to have different thresholds of how much of this description they can take before they check out and they're completely bored and not listening anymore. So this is kind of a tangent, but I always say that a great way to become a better GM is to watch other GMs and learn from what they do well and also learn from their mistakes. Another great way to become a better GM, if you can do it, is to watch or listen to yourself GM. So if you have the ability to record your game sessions, either video or audio or both, you will learn a lot by watching yourself GM and seeing things that you do that you may not realize you're doing or you don't remember it later that were awesome, and things that you do that are not so awesome that you're like, wow, I really don't ever want to do that again. I've learned this because I've been streaming my games on YouTube for years now, and I've learned so much by watching myself and listening to myself run games. And by the way, if you're wondering, personally, as someone who's done video actual play and audio actual play, I get as much value from the audio as I do from the video. I don't think the video really adds anything as far as reviewing a game session and seeing what went well and what didn't. So, if you're someone that you're like, yeah, I think I could record audio, but I'm not sure about video, don't worry. You don't need the video. The audio is good enough. So I usually give the advice of, when you're beginning a campaign, when you're beginning a session, don't start off with a bunch of exposition. Keep it really short. Keep it to the point. And yet, if you're following along my Hinterlands of Elandria campaign, you will notice in the first session, I broke that advice and I started out with this long description of the city of Elandria. And I even did even worse because I wrote the description out ahead of time and I read it. And that's about the worst way to start a campaign. And I know that, and I've told you that so many times on the show, and yet I did it myself. When I wrote the description, I was like, oh, I'll keep it short and it'll be okay. But like anything I write, it tended to get longer than I intended it to be. And then things only seem a lot longer when you're reading them out loud than when you are just reading them to yourself. And as I was doing that during the game, I was realizing that I shouldn't have done this and it was going on too long. But by then I was already kind of into it. So, what are you going to do? So I definitely, if you want to get the most out of this, do as I say, not as I do. But, it's just a reminder that none of us are perfect. And we're all learning and hopefully improving. And also, we don't always run games the same way. I mean, every session I run tends to be some sort of an experiment. I'm trying something different to see how it works. So that time I tried doing the description at the beginning of the campaign. And yeah, as I should have predicted, it didn't work super well. And I'll bet if I would have at the end of that session, if I would have given the players a quiz about stuff I told them at that beginning exposition, that they probably would have all flunked the quiz as far as being able to recall details that I shared because they were probably bored to tears. All right, so we've got quick NPCs and then we've got detailed NPCs. These are the player character or the non-player characters that you anticipate will be important for some reason. So for NPCs who play larger roles in your adventures, allow more time to flesh out their histories and personalities. As you'll see, 10 sentences can sum up the main elements of a memorable NPC, one sentence for each of the following things. And this is probably semantics here, but they don't need to be sentences, people. They can be phrases, bullet points. This isn't high school English class. You don't have to put everything in a complete sentence. So 10 elements to describe about a character. I think what they really mean here by saying sentences is keep it short, right? So occupation and history, appearance, abilities, talent, mannerism, interactions with others, useful knowledge, And then ideal, bond, flaw, or secret. And I would add an 11th. This is a glaring oversight, I feel like. Although it sort of can be encapsulated between the ideal and the bond. But I think it's much easier and better to spell this out separately, which is the NPC's goal. What do they want in this encounter? So if you're planning an encounter with an NPC, with the player characters, think about what is the NPC's goal during this encounter? What do they want? And that will help you, I think, much more than any of these other things in guiding your role playing and deciding how the NPC is going to react to different things. And in any situation, we usually have a goal, something we're trying to accomplish or something that we want. So if you know that about the NPC, that can be a big help. All right, so now we're going to focus in on these 10 things a little bit more. So occupation and history is the first one. The first thing you can think about when you're fleshing out an NPC you want to be more detailed with. In one sentence or phrase, describe the NPC's occupation and provide a brief historical note that hints at the character's past. For example, the NPC might have served in an army, been imprisoned for a crime, or adventured years ago. And, coming up with their occupation is pretty obvious. You probably don't need anyone to tell you to come up with that. But the history part is a nice addition because it gives you a little context for the character. It gives you some idea of what their past has been like, which can help inform you on their personality and how they might react to various things that the players' characters do or say. And it also can give you some fodder if they get into a conversation with this character of maybe a story this character might tell from his past, or an experience the character might have had that might be relevant, or information they might have to give to the player characters. So having at least some idea of a little bit of historical context for this character can come in really handy when you're role-playing them. Next is appearance. In one sentence or phrase, describe the NPC's most distinctive physical features. You can roll on the NPC appearance table. Okay, so for a lot of these, they're going to have tables with example things. So for appearance, it's example features. And like any table in this book, you can roll on it, you can pick something from it, you can completely ignore it, or you can use a table to inspire your own idea of something that's not on the table. So for instance, the NPC appearance table, we've got everything from a distinctive piece of jewelry to an unusual skin color to different types of hairstyles, a twitch of the eye, and things like that. And again, like all these things, this is hopefully going to help you in limiting it to a sentence or a phrase. But remember, when it comes to appearance, you only want 2 or 3 things. You don't want a laundry list of physical features of this person, because again, if you tell the players 12 things about this character, they're probably not going to remember any of them. But if you tell them just 2 or 3, they will probably remember at least a couple of them, if not all of them. So think what are the 2 or 3 most interesting or most unique or unusual things about this character, and describe those. Next is abilities. Now, you don't need to roll ability scores for the NPC, but note abilities that are above or below average. Great strength or monumental stupidity, for example, and use them to inform the NPC's qualities. So again, unless you're going to use this NPC in combat, you don't need stats for them, but it can be helpful to know if there's a certain ability that they're especially good or not good at for role-playing. And again, they have charts here to help you if you need them. So they have a chart for the high ability, and I mean, there's 6 abilities, strength through charisma. So you just roll D6. And then they have a chart for a low ability. So there you go. It's pretty simple. And so you could, if you want to, you could go through here and create a completely random NPC. That might be a fun exercise. And I considered doing that as we went through this, but I have a feeling this is going to be long anyway. These episodes always are. So I figured for the sake of time, we would skip that. But you could go through here, create a random NPC, and see what you come up with. And I think the challenge there would be making sense of that and making that character playable. But it could be fun. So next is talent. In one phrase, describe something that your NPC can do that is special, if anything. So maybe they don't have a talent, right? So again, they have a table. We've got things from plays a musical instrument to speak several languages fluently, draws beautifully. They're an expert carpenter. They're a skilled dancer, knows thieves can't, et cetera, et cetera. So something that they can do that not everybody can do, or something that they can do especially well. Next is a mannerism. In one phrase, describe one mannerism that will help players remember the NPC. Roll on. Okay, so again, they have a table. So this this is one of those GM tools that can definitely be overused. I think if you do this with every NPC, you're probably overusing it. It can get really gimmicky really fast, but it's something to at least consider for your NPCs. So these mannerisms, everything from speaks loudly to slurs words to uses colorful oaths and exclamations, makes constant jokes or puns, fidgets, squints, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think you can see just from those examples that you could get really obnoxious, annoying, and stupid with that. So, use in moderation. All these tools, remember, are spices and seasonings that we're adding to our dish of an adventure. And, you don't want to add too little. You don't want to add too much. Interactions with others. In one sentence, describe how the NPC interacts with others using the table if necessary. An NPC's behavior can change depending on who or she is interacting with. For example, an innkeeper might be friendly toward guests and rude toward her staff. And, this is true for most people. Most people behave differently in different social situations. So that's something you can think about too. So again, there's a table of traits to help you. Things like argumentative, arrogant, curious, friendly, hot-tempered, etc. Useful knowledge. Now, this is one, I'd say some of these, you don't necessarily want to do this with every character. Useful knowledge might be a fun one to do with every NPC, if only to teach your players that it pays to talk to NPCs and dig a little deeper if every NPC potentially has something useful that they know. In a sentence, describe one bit of knowledge the NPC possesses that might be of use to the player characters. The NPC might know something as banal as the best inn in town, or as important as a clue needed to solve a murder. So, again, the whole seasoning analogy here or metaphor, you want to use this with moderation. Now, I would say you can use this with every NPC, but where you want to consider moderation is in the types of knowledge that they know. You don't want every NPC the player characters talk to know some important piece of knowledge for their quest or the story, or whatever, because that would get really contrived really quick. But what you can do is, like they're saying, have some NPCs that have knowledge that's useful, but it's more mundane knowledge. Like they said, like where the best inn is in town, or who's the best blacksmith in town to make you a new weapon, or which merchant will give you the best prices, stuff like that. So you can have an NPC that has knowledge that will be useful, but it's not everything tying directly into your story, because that gets really silly really quick. Ideal. So in a phrase, describe one ideal that the NPC holds dear and which governs his or her greater actions. Player characters who uncover an NPC's ideal can use what they've learned to influence the NPC in a social interaction, as discussed in Chapter 8, Running the Game. Ideals can connect to alignment, as shown in this table, and then they have various ideals tied with different alignments. I have to say, I'm not as much a fan of the whole bond ideal flaw thing as I think a lot of people are in 5th edition. I like the concept of it. I like the idea of, hey, let's flesh out a character's personality and their goals and what drives them. I think we could come up with better ways to define that than the ideal bond and flaw thing. Especially the ideal just doesn't really work for me. It's so oversimplified, which it's kind of funny. It's tied to alignment, which is also oversimplified. I don't know anyone that can be boiled down to one ideal. Some people don't have any ideals. Some people have a lot of ideals. I don't know. I don't find this terribly useful. And the whole idea of tying it into mechanics and saying, oh, if you somehow figure out this word that I've decided is this NPC's ideal, you're going to get bonuses on rolls with them. Like that's just way too gamey, and that just seems really stupid to me. So I would never do that. I don't know if anybody does do that. I kind of use the ideals, bonds, and flaws like I use alignment. They're tools that the players are welcome to use to flesh out their characters that they find that useful. But I don't really care much about them. I don't really refer much to them in play. Because after I've run for a given player character for a couple sessions, I have a far better impression of their personality and what drives them than I'm going to get from their ideals, bonds, and flaws anyway. So I think if anything, they're useful during character creation to help a player kind of zero in on who is this character. But after that, their usefulness kind of falls away. And when it comes to NPCs, I don't use them. I know, if you get like Wizards, D&D adventures and stuff, all their NPCs have bonds, flaws, and ideals, which is awesome. I'm glad that they do that. But when I create NPCs, I don't do that because I don't approach NPCs in that way. I also don't usually define alignments for my NPCs because I've talked quite a bit about alignment on the show, and I think in the near future I'm going to do an episode on alignment. So we'll save that conversation for that. But I don't even tend to assign alignments to most NPCs. I instead focus on their personality, what they're like, what it's like to talk to this person. And I focus on, like I said before, their goals. What do they want? What are they striving for? What are they trying to accomplish? And why are they interacting with the player characters right now? And I use that to drive them. And for me, that works a lot better than these kind of arbitrary things of the bond and flaw and ideal. Because again, a lot of people realistically wouldn't have all of those. So I don't find it terribly useful, but your mileage may vary. Yeah. And this really kind of shows up when you look at the actual ideals, because we have ideals like beauty. Like, do you know anyone in your life who has devoted their life to the concept of beauty? I don't. Charity, not maybe charity. There are people that are all about charity. Yeah. So those are good ones. But yeah, you can check out that table for more examples. Then we have bond. In a phrase, summarize the people, places, or things that are especially important to the NPC. And then again, they have a table. And then you can refer to the backgrounds chapter in the player's handbook for more bonds and things like that. Now bond can be a little bit more useful than an ideal. But again, it's kind of caught up in the goal. Right? I mean, if there's a bond that's actually affecting that character's actions, it's going to be reflected in their goals that you come up with. Flaw or secret, in one phrase, describe the NPC's flaw, some element of the character's personality or history that could potentially undermine the character, or what they're really saying, it could potentially be used by the player characters against them, or a secret that the NPC is trying to hide. So they have a table here of some examples, and this is a great thing. I think this is a great thing to do. I tend to focus more on secrets. Yeah, everybody has flaws. Most people have more than one. I think everybody probably has more than one. But I don't know. Flaws tend to come out on their own through role playing, I feel like. But coming up with secrets, and again, this can be overused, so you don't necessarily want to have every NPC have a secret, but having NPCs that have some secret knowledge that might be useful if the player characters realize they know this thing and get them to share it, that can be a lot of fun. So that's their things. And again, I'll add my own of a goal, which I think if you come up with good goals, you don't need to worry about ideals, bonds, and flaws so much. But what does this NPC want? And this works for any NPC. So, the player characters go into an inn. They want to get rooms. They go and talk to the innkeeper. What does the innkeeper want in the scene? Well, the innkeeper wants the player character's money. He wants, their patronage. He wants to make them happy and take care of them. But he also wants to take care of his other guests and run his establishment and keep everything safe and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's really a mundane example. but maybe the player characters fight some goblins and they capture a goblin and they're interrogating this goblin, and you as a GM are trying to decide, how am I going to role play this goblin? And sure, you could worry about the goblin's ideals, bonds, and flaws, but in an interrogation situation, are any of those going to come into play? Probably not. However, that goblin's goals will very much come into play, which maybe the goblin's goal is to escape alive from the player characters. So if I know that this goblin's goal right now is to escape alive, then it's very easy to decide whether or not the goblin answers their questions and what the goblin says. On the other hand, if the goblin's goal is to keep his secrets to his death if necessary, then again, that informs how I'm going to roleplay that goblin in that situation. And you can see with those two different goals, I would roleplay that goblin very differently. With the first goal of, I just want to get out of here alive, the goblin will be very cooperative and will do whatever it has to do to get on the PC's good side and walk away from the situation. With the second goblin, whose goal is to keep the secrets of his tribe to his death, I'd play that goblin very differently. He's not going to answer questions, or he's going to answer questions falsely and with answers that are deliberately designed to lead the player characters in the wrong direction or lead them into a deadly scenario or something like that. So again, I think kind of a shortcut through all this is just think about the NPC's goal, and that'll give you a lot of mileage. And I'm really wondering why that isn't a thing in here. Again, you can kind of, say that, oh, well, if I really flesh out their ideals and their bonds, then I could infer their goals from that. And yeah, you could, but it's a lot quicker and easier just to define their goals and call it a day. All right, so now we talk about monsters as NPCs. Named monsters, and I would say unnamed monsters. I don't know why it matters if you give them a name or not, that play a significant role in an adventure deserve the same attention you would give to a humanoid NPC, with mannerisms as well as ideals, bonds, flaws, and secrets, or goals, if you want to take the shortcut, get to the point. And I'll also point out, if you have murder hobo players who just, they think every orc is evil and, they just kill monsters indiscriminately and that's it, and they think, combat is the solution to every problem. I know a lot of you, from what I hear, have players like that. This is a great way to try to teach the players a better way to play, or a more interesting way to play, is to flesh out your monsters. The first thing you should ask yourself, I think, as a GM, if you have murder hobo players, is am I kind of setting them up for that? Am I indirectly telling them that that's what I want? And if you're presenting, for instance, all orcs as evil, irredeemably evil, and none of the monsters want to have a conversation and none of the monsters have developed personalities, then you're kind of promoting murder hobo type play. So conversely, a great way to discourage that kind of play is start developing NPCs for your monsters, have them converse with the player characters, have them have goals, have them not all be the same cookie cutter personality. Just because you're an orc doesn't mean that you're chaotic evil or whatever the monster manual says they are, any more than just because you're a human doesn't mean that you're lawful good, right? I mean, so, you actually set a lot of stuff up, how you present the game to your players. You're kind of telling them what your expectations are. And if every orc they meet is irredeemably evil and just wants to fight them, then you're encouraging murder hobo play. So if you don't want that, then make things a little more complex and more nuanced. If a beholder mastermind is behind the criminal activities in a city, don't rely just on the entry in the monster manual to describe the creature's appearance and personality. Take the time to give it a bit of background, a distinctive quirk of appearance, and especially an ideal bond and flaw. Yeah, they're really shilling the ideal bond and flaw or goals, as I said. And keep in mind that what you read in the monster manual, that is an example of a an average generic version of that monster. No individual monster should really be that, right? So when you look at a beholder in the monster manual, everything from the description of its personality to its actual statistics, the stats it has, that's a generic average beholder, which no single beholder really should be generic or average. Now, I'm not saying you can't ever just use a monster out of the book. Obviously, we do that a lot for the sake of time. But an important monster, like, something that's more than just some nameless orc the player characters are going to kill, but is, a character like this beholder they're talking about. I really encourage you to step outside the box of the monster manual and give them their own stats that are different from what's in the monster manual. Give them their own hit points. Decide their personality. And, not every beholder is the same. So decide what's unique about this beholder, what makes them different. So they give an example here of Xanathar, who is the beholder who lives under Waterdeep and runs an extensive criminal operation. So they did a little bit with Xanathar's description. And if you have Volo's Guide, they have a chapter in there on beholders. And they actually, if I remember right, there's charts you can use. But they have all different variations of how beholders can look, how many eyes they have, what their eyes look like, what their eye stalks look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they say Xanathar's spherical body is covered in leathery flesh with a texture similar to cobblestones. Its eye stalks are jointed like the legs of an insect, and some of the stalks have magic rings on them. The Xanathar's speech is slow and deliberate, and it prefers to turn its central eye away from creatures it speaks to. Like all beholders, it sees other creatures as inferior, though it understands the usefulness of its humanoid minions. The Xanathar uses the sewers beneath Waterdeep to access virtually any location within or under the city. The Xanathar's ideal is greed. It craves powerful magic items and surrounds itself with gold, platinum, and precious gems. Its bond is to its lair, an elaborate cavern complex carved out between the twisting sewers of Waterdeep, which it inherited from its predecessors and cherishes above all others. Its flaw is a weakness for exotic pleasures, finely prepared foods, scented oils, and rare spices and herbs. Establishing this information allows you to play the Xanathar as more than an ordinary beholder. The complexities of the creature's characterization create more memorable interaction and interesting story possibilities. And again, the more you do this with the more NPCs and monsters you do this, the richer your game becomes and the less you're encouraging murder hobos. All right, so now let's talk about NPC statistics. So basically, when you give an NPC game stats, you have three options. You could give the NPC only the few stats that it needs. So maybe, it's going to be a social interaction and you figure, I just need to know their charisma. They have any social skills like persuasion or deception. And, maybe I'll need to know their wisdom or their intelligence, but that's all I really need to know. So you can go that route. Just come up with the few things that you're going to need. Or you can give the NPC a monster stat block, or, and this is the last option you should take, you could give the NPC a class and levels like a player character. Don't do that. More on that later. The latter two options require a bit of explanation. So remember, the first option is just you give them a few stats that you think might come up, but that's it. You're not fleshing out their whole stats like you would like a monster stat block or a character sheet. So first we'll talk about using a monster stat block. So Appendix B of the Monster Manual contains statistics for many generic NPCs that you can customize as you see fit. And Chapter 9 of this book offers guidelines on adjusting their statistics and creating a new stat block. There are also more NPCs in Volo's Guide to Monsters in the back of that book. So, yeah, that's funny. That's all they say about using a monster stat block. So this is usually what you want to do. Well, okay, usually what you want to do is probably just a few stats that you might need. And a lot of times you can come up with that on the fly. Remember, they suggested just deciding if there are any attributes that the NPC is especially good or poor at. So you can just do that. And then if you need an actual stat, you can come up with that on the fly. So for instance, let's say the player characters are going to interact with a barkeeper, innkeeper. And I decide beforehand, okay, he has an above average charisma, because that makes sense for an innkeeper, that they'd be charismatic if they're good at their job. And just to make things interesting, I'll give him something he's below average at. So I'll say he has below average intelligence. And we'll consider everything else the average. So for a human, average is a 10. So, as far as, in kind of a ballpark sense, I figure most of his attributes are 10, and then his intelligence is less than 10, and his charisma is more than 10. And as I think about this, I'm like, well, the low intelligence could actually be somewhat of an asset, in that he, the way I might role play this is, he remembers people's faces. So if you've been in his bar before and you come in again, he remembers you, that you've been in there before. But because of his below average intelligence, he doesn't remember their names, and he doesn't remember really any details about them, which, if he has shady customers, could actually be a good thing, because if people come in asking questions like the authorities or the guard or whatever, or PCs investigating a crime, he's not going to remember details about the guy that came in and got a drink last night. He might remember that he came in, but that's about it. He's not going to remember his name. He's not going to remember who he was with or what he talked about or where he went after he left or anything like that. So, just by coming up with a stat that he's good at and when he's not so good at, it informs my role playing. But I don't know what the actual numbers are, and I probably don't need to know. But if it comes up in play that suddenly I need to know what his insight bonus is because the player characters are trying to lie to him, I can come up with that on the fly. So I already decided that he has above average charisma, below average intelligence, and average everything else. So insight is a wisdom skill, I believe. For the sake of argument, we'll say it's wisdom because I don't want to look it up, but I think it's wisdom. So he has an average wisdom, which means he has a 10 or maybe an 11 in wisdom, which means he has no bonus to wisdom. So unless he actually has the insight skill, which he might as a bartender, that's something I'd have to decide. Is he especially good at insight or not? But so if he doesn't have the skill, then his bonus is 0. If he does have the skill, his bonus is 2. So, very quickly on the fly, you can come up with those numbers during play if you need to. And then what I would recommend if you do that is write that down. So if I define, okay, he has a wisdom of 10 and he has the insight skill, I would just write that down and record that later for that NPC so that I can be consistent. Because if he had the insight skill today, then if the player characters talk to him again next week, he should still have the insight skill, right? His bonus should be the same. So I would definitely take notes of things that you come up with on the fly so that you can remember them later and be consistent. And then you can have your write-ups for your NPCs, and after a game session, you can add to those as you come up with stuff on the fly. But if you need more than that, like if you anticipate you're going to need more than that, then I highly, highly, highly recommend that you use one of the NPCs from the Monster Manual and or from Volo's Guide, as opposed to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is making an actual PC that you're going to use as an NPC. If you look at those NPCs, or really you look at any monster in the Monster Manual, you'll see that you have a lot of what you need and not a lot of what you don't need, especially if you just look at the stat block, right? So that's the problem with using a player character as an NPC is, player characters are designed to be run by players who are running one character. So a certain level of complexity is okay with a player character because that player, all they're doing is dealing with that one character. But as a GM, you're running lots of characters. And so we want to streamline characters as much as we can. We don't want a bunch of added complexity that's great for a player, but not great for a GM, because we got to run all these different characters and it bogs down play. So, if you look at an NPC from the Monster Manual, let's grab one for an example here. I happen to have my Monster Manual here. And let's say, because I think the most common time when a DM is going to be tempted to make a player character to use as an NPC is when an NPC is going to adventure with the player characters. So let's say the player characters don't have a cleric or any kind of character that can heal. So that they decide we're going to hire a cleric to adventure with us. All right. So this is going to be an NPC. Instead of making a cleric PC, you can just use one of these NPCs. So let's find one here that will work. Priest. This will probably work. So if we look on page 348 of the monster manual, we have the priest. And right here, I'll very quickly tell you what we're told about the priest here. He's got an armor class of 13 due to his chain shirt. He has hit points 27, 5d8 plus 5 hit dice, speed 25, 10 strength, 10 dex, 12 con, 13 intelligence, 16 wisdom, 13 charisma. His skills include medicine, persuasion, and religion. We're given bonuses for those. And any other skill that isn't in that list, you would just use the attribute bonus. Senses, he's got a passive perception of 13, which we know because of how passive perception works. We know he has a perception bonus of +3 because passive perception is 10 plus their perception bonus. So he has a bonus of +3. Languages, he can speak any 2 languages. So on the fly, as a DM, you could decide what those are. One would be common, and then one would be maybe a racial language, because these NPCs in the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide, for the most part, unless it says otherwise, it's assumed that they're human, but you can easily make them any race you want and just add the racial stuff. So if this priest is an elf, then, you know, he gets a bonus to his dex and et cetera, et cetera. And his second language obviously would be Elvish or Elven. All right. Challenge of 2. He's got Divine Eminence as an ability. As a bonus action, the priest can expend a spell slot to cause its melee weapon attacks to magically deal an extra 10 or 3d6 radiant damage to a target on a hit. This benefit lasts until the end of the turn. If the priest expends a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the extra damage increases by 1d6 for each level above first. So again, you know, you're like, okay, the player characters hired a cleric to travel with them. What should I do? And you think, oh, I'll make a cleric PC. I mean, you could do that, but you'll end up regretting it most likely. And also it's more tempting for that to become a DM PC, which is a whole nother topic for another day. If you make an actual player character, because you're investing time into this character now, sunk cost starts to sink in. See what I did there? Anyway, so you could do that, or you could just use this guy, right? And people be like, oh, but Lex, you know, he won't be as cool as a player character. Well, it depends what you mean by cool. But if you mean he won't be able to do the things that a player character would do, the important things he will. So Divine Eminence is basically capturing, like, for instance, the war cleric's ability to do another attack. A lot of clerics get abilities to do additional damage, things like that. So instead of worrying about all that and making a whole character, we just have this Divine Eminence ability where they can burn a spell slot and do extra radiant damage on a hit. So it effectively is doing the same thing. They have a way to do some more damage and also to do radiant damage, which can be useful against things like fiends and undead, but in a much more simplified form that will be easier to manage for GM. Spellcasting. The priest is a 5th level spellcaster. So right here, okay, this is a 5th level spellcaster. So if your player characters are 1st level and they're hiring a priest to travel with them, this guy might be a little too overpowered for them, but it wouldn't be hard to dial him down to a 1st level spellcaster and change some of his other stats to make him more like a 1st level character, like change his hit dice or whatever. But would still take you far less time to do that, to modify this NPC, than it would to make an actual player character. And then we have, he's a 5th level spellcaster. Spellcasting ability is Wisdom. Spell save DC of 13, plus 5 to hit with spell attacks. And then we've got his prepared spells. So cantrips, he's got Light, Sacred Flame, and Thaumaturgy. 1st level spells with 4 slots. He's got Cure Wounds, Guiding Bolt, Sanctuary. Second level spells with 3 slots, he's got Lesser Restoration, Spiritual Weapon. And third level with 2 slots, he's got Dispel Magic and Spirit Guardians. We then have his actions. He's got a mace, melee weapon attack, +2 to hit, 1d6 bludgeoning damage. And that's it. That's the priest. And I hope you can see that as a DM running an NPC cleric who's running around with the player characters, that gives you everything you need to be able to run this character in combat, to be able to have this character have some healing abilities that he or she can use to help the player characters, while not having to deal with all the crap you'd have to deal with an actual cleric PC character that you're running. So it's just a lot easier and quicker to use and easier to modify and customize. All right, so let's talk about using classes and levels instead of using a stat block. You can create an NPC just as you would a player character, using the rules in the player's handbook. You can even use a character sheet to keep track of the NPC's vital information. Class options. In addition to the class options in the player's handbook, 2 additional class options are available for evil player characters and NPCs: the Death Domain for clerics and the Oathbreaker for paladins, and these are later in this chapter. Equipment. Most NPCs don't need an exhaustive list of equipment. An enemy meant to be faced in combat requires weapons and armor, plus any treasure the NPC carries, including magic items that might be used against the adventurers. So again, refer to stat blocks in the monster manual and you'll see that they have the weapons and armor that they need to do what they do in combat, and that's it. Now, it would be nice, I think, and I've never seen this in a D&D book, but it would be nice if the monster manual had sample treasure for NPCs and for monsters, so that if you wanted to as a GM, you could just hand out the treasure in the entry and not have to come up with the treasure separately. And the reason I say that isn't so much because coming up with treasure is a big deal, is because especially like if you're doing like a random encounter or some kind of encounter on the fly that you didn't plan, it would be nice to have an example of the treasure that the NPC has, especially when it comes to things like potions and other magic items that they might actually use in the encounter. Because what can happen sometimes is you come up with this encounter on the fly. You didn't plan to do it. You come up, they're going to fight some bugbears or whatever. They fight the bugbears. They defeat the bugbears. And then the player characters are like, we loot their bodies. And so you're like, oh, crap, I should come up with their treasure. And then you come up with their treasure and you're like, they had a ring of protection. That they probably would have been using that. And that would have changed their armor class. And now it's kind of a bummer. Now, here's a tip for you. The easiest way to avoid that, since we don't get sample treasures, is when you do treasure in those situations, is don't use the hoard or the lair treasures tables. Use the individual treasure tables, which represents basically what that character is carrying in their pockets, which really 9 times out of 10 is going to be what's appropriate in that kind of situation anyway. Usually you're not going to have a random encounter in a creature's lair. And usually those tables are limited to just coins, and I think maybe sometimes gems, but they're not going to have magic items, and they're not going to have art objects and things like that. So you're not going to have that situation of rolling up a magic item that the NPC might have used in the encounter. So that's kind of an easy way to deal with that. But we'll probably talk about that more when we get to the treasure chapter. And then challenge rating. An NPC built for combat needs a challenge rating. Use the rules in Chapter 9 to determine the NPC's challenge rating as you would for a monster you designed. So yeah, this is the reason why you don't want to use actual PCs for opponents, because that's the 2 big things I see. I see GMs who want to use an actual player character for an NPC that's going to journey with the party. And then I see GMs that want to use an actual player character for like the nemesis of the player characters, because they think, the big bad guy somehow would be better if it was a player character instead of an NPC, which isn't true. But some GMs think that. And you open a whole can of worms in that situation, because now you got to figure out what this guy's CR is. And as someone who has designed my own monsters and modified monsters, I can tell you that determining the CR of a monster can be a real headache. And determining the CR of a player character is going to be 10 times worse. So yeah, avoid it if you can. It's not worth it. All right. So just to quickly recap, you have three basic options when it comes to how you're going to represent NPCs mechanically in the game. You can just not worry about mechanics because you don't think you're going to need them, and maybe come up with, a stat that they're especially good at and a stat they're not good at, and call it a day. And then if you need more, come up with it on the fly during play. I would recommend that for NPCs that you anticipate not being important or not using in combat. You can use an NPC or a monster stat block or modify one, which is what I would recommend anytime you need more in-depth stats than just knowing what they're good or bad at. And finally, you can create an actual player character for the NPC, which I recommend against in pretty much every situation. In any situation, you're better off with an actual NPC. Even if you create your own NPC, it will take less time than creating a player character. So I mentioned some of the reasons. It's just easier. It's simpler. An NPC is designed for the GM to run. A player character is designed for a player to run. So it's just going to work more smoothly at the table. Another reason is player characters are more complicated and level up. So every time the player characters level up, if you're leveling up your NPC player character too, then they're changing as well, and that's paperwork you got to do. Another reason is you're going to be more tempted to run this non-player character as a DM PC if you actually create a PC. I mean, it is a DM PC. You created a PC. I mean, come on. You've invested so much time into this non-player character, and you're thinking of it like a player character. You're only human. You're going to want to play it as a player character, and it's going to be harder to resist that urge than if you just use an NPC stat block. And thankfully, between the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide, we've got a pretty good pool of NPC stat blocks to pull from. So chances are good that there's exactly what you're looking for. Like we found the priest for a cleric that journeys with the party. But even if there's not, you can find something close and then modify it, which again is a lot easier to do with an NPC. And finally, my last reason that I would recommend using an NPC instead of a PC is because NPCs don't follow the same rules as PCs. They follow simplified rules, and it's just a lot easier to do what you want to do. Like, for instance, remember the priest example we gave? We didn't have to worry about what domain does he have and what domain powers does he have. He just has this very useful power to do more damage by spending a spell slot, kind of like a paladin. So it's a lot easier just to come up with something like that to do what it is you want this NPC to be able to do, as opposed to trying to find the right class combination to make what you want to happen. And you can just come up with the abilities you want them to have and then figure out what their CR is. It's a lot easier. And you're not limited to the mechanics of player characters. So, maybe you want this NPC to be able to do this thing that a wizard can do, but also be able to do this thing as a cleric can do. Well, you could make a multi-classed NPC and go through all that headache and maybe make the thing happen you want to happen. Or you could just make an NPC that can do those two things and call it a day. And I would either start with a priest NPC or an appropriate arcane NPC and just modify that and call it a day. Probably take like 5 minutes or less. All right, let's talk about NPC party members. We've been kind of poking at this topic a little bit as we've been going. So let's dig into this. So NPCs might join your adventuring party because they want to share the loot and are willing to accept an equal share of the risk, or they might follow the adventurers because of a bond of loyalty, gratitude, or love. Such NPCs are controlled by you, the GM, or you can transfer control to the players if you want. Even if a player controls an NPC, it's up to you, the GM, to make sure the NPC is portrayed as a character in his or her own right, not just as a servant that the players can manipulate for their own benefit. Yeah, that's a really great point. Don't let your player characters abuse your NPCs. Be true to your NPCs, to their characters, and play them as they would react. Any NPC that accompanies the adventurers acts as a party member and earns a full share of experience points. When determining the difficulty of a combat encounter, make sure to include all NPC party members. So yeah, that's a really important point. You know, if the player characters hire a cleric to adventure with them and heal for them, then that cleric receives an equal share of XP, even if you're using an NPC who doesn't really get XP and doesn't level up, they still, quote, get a share, which is to say, you know, let's say you have 6 players and then they have this NPC. Each player is getting a 1/7 of the total XP instead of a 1/6, because you're giving a share to that NPC. And also when you're balancing the encounters, you're counting that NPC as a member of the encounter. So you would balance an encounter for 7 characters instead of 6 in that example. Now, I would say that is true for an NPC that is going to be useful in combat and non-combat situations. And I say non-combat because you could have an NPC where they're not super useful in combat, but they're very good with people, and the player characters are relying on them in social situations, which that's definitely a situation to avoid, because you want to try to avoid role-playing with yourself, especially when you're role-playing on behalf of the player characters. Like, they should be doing that. I hope you see that. But if that happened, I would say that NPCs should get an equal share of the XP, even if they're useless in combat, because they're being useful. However, if you have a situation where the NPC isn't useful, then you don't necessarily have to do that. So, for instance, in my current campaign, Hinterlands of Elandria right now, there are actually 2 NPCs that are traveling with the party right now. And I think one of them actually might be a spoiler, because I don't think I've released that episode yet. But one of the NPCs is Miguel, who is a prisoner that the player characters have. And Miguel is always tied up. Miguel is always gagged. So Miguel is no help in a combat. In fact, he's a liability in a combat, because the player characters have to worry about keeping him alive, and he can't even defend himself because he's tied up and he doesn't have any weapons or armor or anything. So he's no use in combat. He's a liability in combat, and he's no use in any other situation at all either, because again, he's tied up and gagged, so he can't, be an asset socially or an exploration. And again, he's a liability, because if they're exploring, they got to drag him along. So in that situation, I don't give Miguel a share of XP, because he's not really contributing anything. And in reality, he's actually making the situation more difficult. The second NPC, which I'm not going to say much about because I think it'll spoil, because I don't think I've released those episodes yet, but there's the second NPC that joins the party, and she could go either way. She definitely has abilities that could be useful in and out of combat. So right now, I'm not giving her a share of XP because she hasn't been useful. When they get into combat, she doesn't participate. She hides and she doesn't participate. She hasn't done anything to help the player characters out in social situations or exploration or anything like that. So right now, I don't give her a share of XP. But if she ever started using her abilities in combat to help the characters, or using them in social situations, or if she started helping them navigate or something like that, where I think this NPC is making life easier because she's there, then she would get a share of the XP. So, it's something that you can adjust from session to session as you need to. You don't have to say, oh, this NPC always gets a share or they never get a share. You can kind of play it on a case-by-case basis if you want to. But I think if the NPC is participating in combat, even if they're not as effective as the player characters, you should definitely be giving them a share of XP, because it's making the encounters easier, because it's adding to the player's action economy, and it's another target for the bad guys to attack. So it's definitely making things easier, and the XP should reflect that. So there are different kinds of NPCs that might travel with the player characters, and the first type are low-level followers. Your campaign might allow player characters to take on lower-level NPCs as followers. For example, a paladin might have a first-level paladin as a squire, and so on and so on. They give a bunch of examples, but that's enough. You know what we're talking about. One advantage of allowing lower level characters to join the party is that players have backup characters if their main characters take time off, retire, or die. One disadvantage is that you and your players have more party members to account for. Since lower level NPC party members receive equal party shares of XP, they will gain levels more quickly than the adventurers, the benefit of studying under such experienced masters, and might eventually catch up to them. It also means the adventurer's advancement is slowed somewhat, as they must share their XP with an NPC shouldering only part of the adventuring burden. Powerful monsters that are an appropriate challenge for higher level characters can deal enough damage to instantly kill or incapacitate a low level follower. The adventurer should expect to spend effort and resources protecting lower level NPC party members and to provide healing when this protection fails. So yeah, that's all great stuff to consider. Another type of NPC that might adventure with the player characters is an actual adventurer NPC. If you don't have enough players to form a full party, whatever that is, and you can use NPCs to fill out the ranks. These NPCs should be the same level as the lowest level adventurer in the party and built either by you or your players using the character creation and advancement rules in the player's handbook, or a better way to say it is the same rules that you use to build the player characters. It's easiest on you if you let the players create and run these supporting characters. Encourage players to roleplay supporting characters as true to the NPC's personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws as possible, so that they don't come across as automatons. If you don't feel that an NPC is being portrayed well, you can take control of the NPC, give it to another player, or simply have the NPC leave the party. NPC supporting characters are easier to play if you limit their class options. Good candidates for supporting characters include a cleric with the life domain, a fighter with the champion archetype, a rogue with the thief archetype, and a wizard specializing in evocation. Or even better advice, use an NPC. Why are you using a PC for an NPC? The only benefit I can see for using an actual PC is if a player character dies and the player wants to play the NPC instead. But my experience has been, I've never had a situation in a game where a player character dies and they have NPCs in the party and the player wants to play one of the NPCs. They always want to make their own new character. The only way I could see that happening is if the NPC is an actual follower of the character. But even if you run into that situation, I mean, first of all, it's rare that happens to begin with. So why deal with the headaches of running a PC as an NPC just on the off chance that happens? If it happens, just convert it, right? So if you're using the priest NPC and one of the characters dies and they want to play the priest NPC, just convert it into a cleric. It'd be really easy to do. And yeah, maybe some of the abilities might change slightly, but who cares? It doesn't really matter. All right, and now we have an optional rule, loyalty. Loyalty is an optional rule you can use to determine how far an NPC party member will go to protect or assist the other members of the party, even those he or she doesn't particularly like. An NPC party member who is abused or ignored is likely to abandon or betray the party, whereas an NPC who owes a life debt to the characters or shares their goals might fight to the death for them. Loyalty can be roleplayed or represented by this rule. So this is a pretty cool little system, and I don't know that I would recommend always using the system, but at the very least, use it as a guide and concept for the fact that an NPC isn't going to put up with crap from the player characters forever. The way I look at it is every NPC has a line. They have a breaking point. They have a certain amount of whatever that they're going to tolerate and no more. And I decide what that point is for that character. And if the players cross it, then that NPC may leave, may turn on them or something. But this system can be useful if you're worried, you want to kind of remove yourself from it a little bit and you want to have some kind of system to back you up. It also, I would use it if I had a group of players where I anticipated that they were going to abuse the NPCs, then I would use this system because it is a way to kind of help you gauge when they've gone too far and kind of have a mechanic around it. But most of the times I wouldn't use it. But if I had a group that I thought I was going to need it, then I would use it. So here's how this system works. So the NPC has a loyalty score, which is measured on a scale from 0 to 20. The NPC's maximum loyalty score is equal to the highest charisma score among all the PCs in the party. And its starting loyalty score is half that number. So if you got a player character with an 18 charisma, then the NPC's highest loyalty they can have is 18, and they start out with a 9 because that's half of 18. If the highest charisma score changes, perhaps a character dies or leaves the group, adjust the NPC's loyalty score accordingly. Or maybe, that PC with the 18 charisma is a bard and he levels up and he raises his charisma to 20, so then that would affect the loyalty of the NPCs in the party because that bard is so more charismatic now. All right, so then you track loyalty. Keep track of an NPC's loyalty score in secret so that the players won't know for sure whether an NPC party member is loyal or disloyal, even if the NPC is currently under a player's control. An NPC's loyalty score increases by 1d4 if other party members help the NPC achieve a goal tied to its bond, or just a goal that you define that it has. Likewise, an NPC's loyalty score increases by 1d4 if the NPC is treated particularly well, for example, given a magic weapon as a gift, or rescued by another party member. An NPC's loyalty score can never be raised above its maximum. When other party members act in a manner that runs counter to the NPC's alignment or bond or goals, reduce the NPC's loyalty score by 1d4. Reduce the NPC's loyalty score by 2d4 if the character is abused, misled, or endangered by other party members for purely selfish reasons. And of course, I would say always be a smart DM, right? If the player characters do something that you think that the NPC would just have had it at that point, don't worry about the stupid loyalty system. Just run it as it should go. An NPC whose loyalty score drops to 0 is no longer loyal to the party and might part ways with them. A loyalty score can never drop below 0. An NPC with a loyalty score of 10 or higher risks life and limb to help fellow party members. If the NPC's loyalty score is between 1 and 10, its loyalty is tenuous. An NPC whose loyalty drops to 0 no longer acts in the party's best interests. The disloyal NPC either leaves the party, attacking characters who attempt to intervene, or works in secret to bring about the party's downfall, which of course is the more interesting option. Contacts are another type of NPC with close ties to one or more of the player characters. They don't go on adventures, but they can provide information, rumors, supplies, or professional advice, either for free or at a cost. Some of the backgrounds in the player's handbook suggest contacts for beginning characters, and characters are likely to secure more helpful contacts over the course of their adventuring careers. A name and a few choice details are all you need for casual contacts, but take the time to flesh out a recurring contact, especially one who might become an ally or enemy at some point. At the very least, give some thought to a contact's goals and how those goals are likely to come into play. Hey, they finally talked about goals. All right, another type of NPC are patrons. A patron is a contact who employs the adventurers, providing help or rewards as well as quests and adventure hooks. Most of the time, a patron has a vested interest in the adventurer's success and doesn't need to be persuaded to help them. A patron might be a retired adventurer who seeks younger heroes to deal with rising threats, or a mayor who knows that the town guard can't handle a dragon demanding tribute. A sheriff becomes a patron by offering a bounty for kobold raiders terrorizing the local countryside, as does a noble who wants an abandoned estate cleared of monsters. So a patron could be a patron just for a single session, for a single task, or they could be a patron for an extended period of time. There are also hirelings. Adventurers can pay NPCs to provide services in a variety of circumstances. You can find out more about that in Chapter 5, Equipment of the PHB. Hireling NPCs rarely become important in an adventure, and most require little development. I don't know about that. They rarely become important. My experience has been that any NPC that is traveling with the party becomes important at some point. When adventurers hire a coach to carry them across town or need a letter delivered, the driver or messenger is a hireling, and the adventurers might never even converse with that NPC or learn his or her name. A ship captain carrying the adventurers across the sea is also a hireling, but such a character has the potential to turn into an ally, a patron, or even an enemy as the adventure unfolds. When the adventurers hire an NPC for long-term work, add the cost of that NPC services to the character's lifestyle expenses if you use the lifestyle system, which we talked about in the Player's Handbook episodes, so you can go check those out. Again, they're all linked in the show notes. So you can see more information about that in the additional expenses section of Chapter 6 of the Player's Handbook, Between Adventures. Or no, Chapter 6 of this book, Between Adventures, which we haven't gone to yet. And then finally, we have extras. Extras are the characters and creatures in the background that the main characters rarely, if ever, interact with. Extras might be elevated to more important roles by virtue of adventurers singling them out. For instance, a player might be hooked by a passing reference you make to a street urchin and try to strike up a conversation with the youngster. Suddenly, an extra on whom you place no importance becomes a central figure in an improvised role-playing scene. Whenever extras are present, be prepared to come up with names and mannerisms on the fly. In a pinch, you can plunder the race-specific character names found in Chapter 2 Races of the PHB. Or even better, if you have it, we've got much more extensive name lists in Xanathar's Guide. If you don't have Xanathar's Guide, another great source for names is there are tons of websites online for getting baby names. And there are some really good ones where you can look through names based on nationality, and that can be a great source of fantasy names. If you pick a nationality that you and your players aren't terribly familiar with, you can get a lot of what sound like strange and fantastic names to you that way. And what I recommend and what I do is I have lists of names that I've created ahead of time for the campaign. So I have a list of male first names, female first names, and then family names. And then anytime something like this happens where some bit character that I didn't think much about becomes center stage because the player characters interact with them and they ask their name, I just pick a name from that list and then make a note that this character's name is now this, and then I cross the name off the list and there we go. So that's a really easy way to handle that. All right. And finally, we have a very important type of NPC, and that is the villain. By their actions, villains provide job security for heroes. I love that sentence. Chapter 3 helps you determine suitable villains for your adventurers, while this section helps you flesh out their evil schemes, methods, and weaknesses. So we talked about Chapter 3 in a previous episode, so you can check out the show notes for a link to that. So yeah, we've got some really cool tables here to help you flesh out a villain. We've got a table for your villain's scheme, their objective and their scheme. And these are put into categories. There are 8 categories. So there's immortality, influence, magic, mayhem, passion, power, revenge, and wealth. And then each category has a few options within it. So let's look at mayhem. That sounds like fun. Mayhem has 6 options. Fulfill an apocalyptic prophecy, enact the vengeful will of a god or patron, spread a vile contagion, overthrow a government, trigger a natural disaster, or utterly destroy a bloodline or clan. So, this probably isn't going to be super useful for a villain you've already come up with, because you probably already know what their scheme is. But this can be really useful for coming up with new villains, either in prep or even on the fly. And that's another thing I wanted to point out again about all these tables. They can be really useful if you have to come up with an NPC on the fly during play. You can peruse these tables and pick some things quickly or make some rolls and come up with something pretty quickly. We then have a table for the villain's methods. And again, we've got various categories with things underneath them. And there's a lot of stuff on here: agricultural devastation, captivity or coercion, confidence scams, defamation, execution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the first table tells you, what's your villain scheme? What are they trying to do? And then this table gives you their methods. How do they go about achieving their goals? So really useful stuff. And then we have a table on villain's weakness. So good villain often has a weakness, and this has 8 suggestions for you. Things from a hidden object that holds the villain's soul, like a lich's phylactery, or the villain loses his power if a mystic bargain it struck long ago is completed. So that can give you some ideas. So it says, finding and exploiting a villain's weakness can be very gratifying for players, although a smart villain tries to conceal its weakness. A lich, for example, has a phylactery, a magical receptacle for its soul that it keeps well hidden. Only by destroying the phylactery can characters ensure the lich's destruction. So yeah, weaknesses can be a lot of fun. So next we have villainous class options, and this gives us the death domain for clerics and the Oathbreaker subclass for paladins. So I'm not going to go over this. It's pretty self-explanatory. We have a new domain, death, and we have a new paladin subclass, the Oathbreaker, that you could use for NPCs. But again, I personally would use these as inspiration to create an actual NPC. I would not create a player character NPC. And then obviously, if you are running an evil campaign or a campaign where you're okay with evil player characters, these could be additional options that you make available to them. All right, we did it. We got through chapter 4. I was hoping we could power through that today. Our next chapter coming up next is chapter 5, Adventure Environments. We're going to talk about building dungeons and all kinds of good stuff. So that'll be a lot of fun. So yeah, I think we had some good tips and pointers there for creating NPCs and fleshing them out. And again, there are some really useful tables in this chapter that you can use as inspiration when you're doing your preparation to flesh out NPCs, and that you can also use during play for those moments when you have to flesh out an NPC on the fly and you're a little stumped on something. You can roll on those tables or pick things from them, and they can be very helpful. And just kind of a bonus tip, I guess, is, and this is something I seldom remember to do myself, unfortunately. But again, do as I say, not as I do. Never be afraid to take a break. So you may have a situation where, like the example they gave, there's an urchin on the street, and you just kind of describe it to give some flavor and some set dressing, and the players decide to interact with this urchin, and it's going to be more than just a simple little conversation where they're asking where the nearest barbershop is. Maybe you decide maybe this urchin's going to have some information for them or something like that. But you need a minute to figure out what you're going to do. Never be afraid to take a break. You can either just say, hey guys, I need a couple minutes, and let the players just kind of talk amongst themselves while you do what you need to do. Or you can say, hey guys, let's take 5, everybody take a bathroom break or whatever you got to do if you're going to need a little more time. I think the players would prefer for you to take a few minutes or 5 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever you need to do, to create an NPC that's going to be fun to interact with and memorable, as opposed to not taking the break and it's a bland, uninteresting, generic NPC. So I know, at least me personally, I a lot of times I just don't think of it. But even when I do, I feel kind of bad, like stopping the game and say, hey guys, I need a few minutes. But I don't think you should be afraid to do that, because it's often the right thing to do, and you end up being glad that you did it. So don't be afraid to take a break when you need to maybe roll on these charts or think about what you want to do, or flesh out that NPC. So what do you think about this chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide? Do you think this hits the highlights of creating and fleshing out NPCs? I mentioned that I think a lot about the NPC's goals, which was kind of almost completely missed by this chapter, and definitely wasn't called out like I think it should have been. Is there something like that's kind of your go-to for fleshing out NPCs that this didn't mention that you use? If so, let me know, and I'd be happy to pass that on to the other listener GMs. One final thing I'll say is a trick that I use that I've discussed on the show before is I will often cast NPCs. This is something I do a lot with NPCs that I anticipate will be important. In fact, almost any NPC that I flesh out and I think for whatever reason this is going to be an important NPC, I cast them. But it's also a tool I will use during play on the fly if I have to characterize an NPC on the fly. It's really useful for that too. It's even more useful for that too, because it's a shortcut to coming up with a character like right now really quickly. And by casting them, I just mean that I imagine this character played by an actor or a character from another story. And it's really as simple as that. You can get more complex with it. Like you could mash different characters together, So I might say, and usually I don't tell the player characters this. This is a trick for me to help me role play a character. But I might say, this town guard is based on Jaime Lannister or something like that, right? I'm trying to think of other characters. This traveling adventurer that the characters meet is based on Matt Cawthon from the Wheel of Time, or this ship captain they meet is based on Basil Gill from A Wheel of Time, or something like that. So you can pick either a character from a book or a movie or a TV show or an actor, or anything like that. And this can help inform you as far as what this character looks like, can help you inform how they talk, if they have an accent, if you're someone that can do different accents, what their accent might be, how they talk, what kind of vocabulary they use, which is a great trick for GMs like me who can't really do accents. You can do a lot with vocabulary. A character who uses a lot of big words sounds very different than a character who uses really small, simple words all the time. A character who every other word is profanity sounds very different than a character who never swears at all, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a shortcut, so it works really well on the fly when you don't have a lot of time to say, I'm going to base this character on Dean Winchester or whatever, and instantly you're like, okay, I know how they walk. I know how they talk. I know what they think is funny. I know how to describe them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's a little trick I use. I know a lot of GMs use that trick, and that can help a lot. And if nothing else, it can give you a launching off point to get you started. And then you kind of take it from there. So let me know if you have any tricks that you use or any advice you have for fleshing out characters that you think that this missed or overlooked. Let me know. I'd be happy to share it on a future episode. All right, that's going to wrap it up for episode 223 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, there are a lot of great ways to do so. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. You can call my voicemail, 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. If you have comments, questions, or feedback on the show, I'd love to hear from you. You can find all that contact information in the show notes at starwalkercos.com/GameMastersJourney. Also, again, those show notes will have links to previous episodes in the series on the Dungeon Master's Guide, as well as episodes in the series on the Player's Handbook. Also in the show notes, you can find links to connect with other listener GMs on our forum, our Google Plus community, and our Discord server. And you can share your ideas, your questions, your stories, your homebrewed worlds, and your relics with other listener GMs. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to help support the show, you can find all the great ways to do so at starwalkerstudios.com/support. The best way you can support the show and my RPG endeavors is to check out my latest self-published D&D supplement, Relics of Power, which enable you to create magic items that scale and power with your player characters. If you'd like to show off your support for Game Master's Journey, you could also get yourself a Game Master's Journey t-shirt. However you decide to support the show, I really, really appreciate it. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.